Pat Brown, a little while back, we were shooting an episode of MadPropsAero, stellar content that people should subscribe to because it's so good. And you said we should do a piece on airworthiness. And I thought, that's genius. Not only are you a genius, but the idea itself was a genius. It's probably worth covering the concept of airworthiness because I'm not sure it's really that well understood overall.
I think you're probably right.
I looked up because I need to keep up with you. I don't have the voluminous mind you have, but I do have a collection of books that helps me out. And 14 CFR 91.3, typically known as the FARs, 91.3 actually defines what airworthiness is. And basically it says the aircraft has to conform to the type certificate, the type design, and be in condition for safe flight. Kind of broad based, but there's more to it than that, isn't there? I mean, at the very least, there's some paperwork involved.
Well, that's true. And at the end of the day, who is responsible for determining the airworthiness of the airplane, Jamie? I would ask you that question.
That would be the pilot in command. So if you're sitting in the left seat, that's you. It's not the flight school owner. It's not the person you rented it from. It's not your buddy who loaned you the airplane. It's us.
There was an occasion, this is many, many years ago, and I may have some of the details a little fuzzy at this point, but I recall reading a situation where a pilot had picked up his airplane, and I believe it was a Baron
Mhm.
from annual, and took off and had forgotten to remove the there's I think a pin of some sort in the landing gear. I don't remember some of the details, but whatever that did, and forgetting to remove it caused a landing gear failure. And it wasn't the mechanic that got dinged for it; it was the pilot for
Yeah,
forgetting to remove that pin. So um, we have the final responsibility. And you may think, well, that's not fair. And I certainly could argue that point of view. But at the end of the day, we're the ones doing the pre-flight. We're the ones that are making the final decision whether or not we're going to get in that airplane and go or not. So at the end of the day, it's on us.
absolutely right. And when I started flying roughly 120 years ago,
Ah,
there was a mnemonic device we used to remember the paperwork part called ARROW, ARROW. And that
correct.
reminded us of all the paperwork that's got to be in the airplane. That has changed since I started flying and since you started flying because of our advanced age, Pat. Airworthiness
Well,
certificate still has to be there, and it's typically in a little plastic pouch up by the front of the aircraft. Also, the
yeah.
aircraft registration, which unlike the old days, isn't forever. They time out now. They made it, I think, 3 years for a while. Now it's 7 years, but you really do need to look at that to make sure your airplane is actually registered.
That's exactly right. If you have any questions about that, you can always go look on the FAA registry because they've gotten pretty good at updating the expiration dates on the registrations there. And by the way, when I bought my 182 18 months ago, 2 years ago now, I guess, it took me three renewals of that 120-day registration until the hard copy came.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, they're down now to 28 days. I saw that, and I got the same thing that you get from headquarters, updates on legislative activities and things like that. And as of today, we're talking October the 5th of 2023. They're down to, I think it was 23 or 28 days turning around registrations. So the 7 year thing, I'm sure, helped. But
I have a
we're
feeling
now.
that was the whole reason for it because
Right.
renewing the registration on everything every 3 years means you're dealing with a third of the fleet every year. That's an enormous, plus all the purchases, buys, sells. That's an enormous workload.
Yeah. So we're down to let's just call it a month at this point. And that certainly is a big improvement from a couple of years ago. So you've got the airworthiness, you've got the registration.
And then the second R, Pat, and this is huge. Radio license was a requirement when I started flying, and when you started flying. Now it's only required for international flights. So if you're just flying within the contiguous 48, don't you like it when I use a big word like contiguous?
I
The
like that.
48 states that touch each other, not Alaska and Hawaii. If you're there, you don't need a radio license.
Yeah, and it's interesting because back in the day when you and I first started, along with Wilbur and Orville, we also had to have a radio telephone operator's license.
I still have one. It's a
I,
lifetime
as
thing.
do I, as do I. And there was a time earlier than when you and I started flying that you actually had to know Morse code to get that. Do you remember that? Or
Oh yeah,
do you know
actually,
that?
I had a student once who had been in the Air Force, and I think I've told you about this. He was a multi-engine ATP, but didn't have a single engine. So we were working on getting a single commercial so he could fly with the family. And we're using the VOR, and he tunes it in, and he just listens and says, "Okay, that's it." And I'm like, "No, no, you have to use the chart. You have to verify it." And he goes, "I know Morse code. I was in the Air Force."
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I never memorized that.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't have to do that. I'm not sure if that would have been so daunting. I wouldn't have gotten my pilot certificate, but I did not have to do that
Yeah,
at that
that's tough.
time. So the second R, and then you got the O for owner's manual or operating limitations, basically the POH.
But it's more than just the POH, and I think that's an important one. People forget that. The pilot's operating handbook is a generic document. What you're looking for actually is the aircraft flight manual, which is specific to that airplane. Looks exactly like the POH, but the numbers are all for that airplane. But it's also the placards and the compass deviation card. If that little sticker on the panel that says intentional spins prohibited is missing, believe it or not, your airplane's not airworthy. Or if
Yeah.
that compass deviation card fell out somewhere back 1972, that little scrap of paper, you got to replace it. And you got to replace it with an A&P who swings the compass and makes sure it's all right, or you're not airworthy.
Yeah, and where you find that information, as you know, because you're an A and P, I'm not, is in the limitations section, and that'll list all of the placards that have to be on the airplane, and it could be something like a baggage compartment weight limit, for example, 120 pounds or 75 pounds or whatever the number might be. If that's missing, the airplane is legally not airworthy. If there's supposed to be stickers on the wing that says 100 low lead or whatever the case may be, and those stickers are missing, the airplane is legally unairworthy. Now you can fix that in a temporary manner if you want. You could actually take a Sharpie and write that information down in the form that's dictated by the POH and the manual, and you're okay. But it has to be there.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, I flew an airplane once, absolutely beautiful, fully rebuilt, nicely repainted, but they forgot to put the fuel stickers on near the fuel caps. And there has to be a sticker saying what type of fuel goes in it and how much fuel goes in it.
Yep.
And it wasn't there. So even though this airplane looked absolutely gorgeous, it's not a legal airplane. You cannot fly that until those little stickers are applied. And as you said right up top, Pat, that's on the pilot in command. And if you were to get ramp checked someplace and they're like, hey, you don't have that sticker, you don't have that compass deviation guard, you now have a violation. And it was just a simple oversight, which brings us to the one that everybody gets lax on, I'm going to bet, weight and balance. They just
Yep.
get used to flying it and they stop doing the calculations. And man, that can be dangerous. Beyond being a violation, that can truly be dangerous.
Well, you can find yourself being a test pilot, is what it boils down to, if you're not really careful about that. You know, we went to Oshkosh several years ago, and this particular trip, I flew a Malibu, and that's a six-place airplane. It is not, however, a six-person airplane. As a matter of fact, depending on the size of the persons inside that airplane, it might only be a three-place airplane, especially if you've got some bags and full fuel, because that airplane carries 120 gallons of gas. Well, in this case, we had 5 people going to Oshkosh, and so several days beforehand, I got together with the other guy that we were going to share the flying responsibilities, and we sat down and we worked out weight and balance calculations for several different scenarios and seating positions and baggage and things like that. And we came to the conclusion that we could take 5 people that they were all about my size, 170 pounds, 180 pounds, kind of in that general
That didn't
ballpark.
hurt at all. You can just say that all day. I'm fine.
Well, I didn't say our size, Jamie.
Yeah, there's a two that goes before that number with me.
Yeah, well, what, 260 at any rate. Um, so but we calculated out that we could handle 5 people, but we could only take, I want to say, about 60 gallons of gas, maybe 70, and I think we could only afford about 10 or 12 pounds of luggage each. I don't remember the exact numbers now. It's not really important, but the point is that um, that airplane. Now, can that airplane handle the load? Absolutely, can it? Of course. Is it easy to get out of weight and balance? Exceptionally easy to get out of weight and balance. If you put too many people in the way back and you put stuff behind that too, yeah, you can get that airplane out of CG pretty quickly.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that concerns me sometimes is people worry about the max weight, how much is loaded in the airplane, but they stop thinking about the CG envelope. And I'll
Yeah,
tell you, I used to fly a Piper Seneca, which is a lovely panel van of an aircraft. I mean, it flies like a truck.
yeah.
It's an awesome airplane. It's 6 seats. It's great. But Pat, if you and I were to fly the Seneca, both of us sitting in the front row, we need about 100 pounds of ballast in the back because you're not in the CG, you're forward of it. And people don't think of that. And that's not true of a 152 or, Cherokee 140.
Right.
But more than just the full weight with the fuel and the passengers and everything, the baggage, it's also, are you in the CG? And as you fly and burn off fuel, are you going to stay in the CG envelope? Because you might start out in it, but as you burn fuel, you depart from that. And as you say, being a test pilot out of the CG envelope is not a comfortable moment.
No, and you're right about that, Jamie. There are an awful lot of airplanes out there where, as you're burning gas, the line is almost going straight down, maybe a little bit forward. That's pretty common. But there are some airplanes out there, notably some of the Bonanzas, that the CG goes down and aft.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're starting out with an aft CG, when you've got your full passenger compartment and luggage and all that kind of stuff, and you find that you're kind of in an aft CG situation, it makes it particularly important to go ahead and run the numbers and make sure that as you burn down to your near zero fuel or your landing weight or what have you, that CG isn't moving down and backwards. Because I'll bet you that it is, depending on which bonanza you've got. And that could be a real rude awakening if you get upset from normal flight in any way, shape, or form.
Boy, you're not kidding. So that covers the paperwork, the basics that we have to do, but there's also some inspections that are required in order to be considered airworthy. One
Yeah,
of them, if the airplane's being rented out, it's a commercial operation, you got to do the 100-hour inspection, but pretty much everything needs an annual inspection. There's a little caveat to that if you're on a progressive inspection, which very few people are. That's
right.
that's usually companies with fleets. But if you don't have that 100-hour and you don't have that annual, you can't be flying it. And I suspect when an applicant shows up at your office to do a check ride, whether they're a primary student or a commercial applicant or a CFI applicant, if they can't show you that the inspections have been done, I suspect you're not doing the ride, are you?
No, that's true. And, we call them annuals, which is exactly what they are because they have to be done every 12 calendar months. But in the experimental world and in the light sport world, they're called conditional inspections. It's
Mm-hmm.
the same thing. It's an annual. But before somebody listening to us says, well, wait a minute, let's just clarify that there's annual inspections and then there's conditional inspections, which are essentially the same thing, but call different things depending on what type of airplane you're flying. But yeah, that's, we're certainly going to look at that. And along with that, I'm going to be looking for the pedostatic transponder altimeter test, that whole thing. That's not always required. The transponder test is if you're flying an airplane with a transponder. But some of the other stuff is not necessarily required depending on the kind of flying that you do. But certainly looking for that, looking for the ELT. If we're going to be doing a flight that requires VORs, I'm looking for the VOR check that's done every 30 days. And there's 4 different ways that you can do that. And, the tolerances are usually plus or minus 4 or plus or minus 6, depending on when you do it, or 4 degrees difference between the two, which means that one of them could actually be 8 degrees out.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's like your alternator. Your altimeter can be off by 75 feet and still be considered legal.
right.
There's a tolerance built into things. And it is good that you mentioned the condition inspection for an experimental aircraft, because the 100-hour inspection and the annual inspection are the exact same thing. The difference is the 100-hour can be signed off by an A&P. The annual has to be signed off by an IA. The condition inspection can be done by the guy who built the aircraft. And I shouldn't say guy because it could be a woman. We don't know.
Could be, sure.
But the builder can sign that off because they have a repairman certificate, assumably, or an A&P can sign off. But those are critical inspections. And Pat, if I am coming to you for a check ride, and I know DPEs aren't supposed to teach, but we're just talking over coffee 1,000 miles apart. If I was to come in for you for a check ride and I have never looked in a logbook before, how can I prep before I get to you so I know what I'm looking at? Is there somebody that can help me?
Oh, your flight instructor. You must be talking about your flight instructor.
Well, let's hope the guy you're paying or the woman you're paying actually prepares you.
Yeah, well, I mean, either that. I mean, that certainly that would I would say that falls on the shoulders of the flight instructor for sure. But that's not the only person. I mean, if you have a good relationship with a mechanic on your field, you could certainly take the books to the mechanic and say, hey, can we go over these things and make sure I know where everything is? What's cringeworthy for me when we sit down on a check ride situation is if the applicant hasn't looked at the logbooks before. And I had a situation this morning where the applicant hadn't looked at the logbooks in 2 or 3 weeks. And as a result, when we sat down, he's going through and saying, okay, oh, this is the 100. Oh, wait a minute, this 100-hour was done 300 hours ago. Oh, okay. Oh, this was 200 hours ago. And it takes longer than it needs to because they can't go right to the page where somebody, perhaps the applicant or the instructor or the mechanic, is tabbed. Here's where the 100-hour, the most recent one. Here's where the most recent annual is. Here's where the transponder test is. Here's where the ELT test was done.
Yeah, that's something that can really throw you, I've got to admit, because most people aren't aware. There could be, there are multiple logbooks. There's one for the airframe, one for the propeller, one for the engine.
Typically, yes.
And there might be, if it's an old airplane from the 70s or something, there could be multiple logbooks for each of those things. You start with the newest logbook at the last page. I mean, when I owned my J3 Cub, I don't go to September 1940 and start working my way through.
Right.
I start at whatever's in 2023 and work my way backwards.
That's the easiest way to do it.
It's much easier if you've been through it once or twice and you know what you're looking for. And because the other thing that's a problem, as you say, I've got a flight school airplane and I show up and I open it up and, oh, that's the last 100-hour and it was 118 hours ago. Uh-oh.
That may or may not be a problem, though, Jamie, because this is not a teaching situation. They're not paying me to teach them, so the airplane is technically not for hire. So
this is why I hang out with you. You know stuff.
So I could theoretically do that check ride, even though the airplane has not had its 100-hour. Because they're not paying me for flight instruction, and the airplane's not being let for hire. So, but here's the thing:
if it's November 5th and the annual was good through October, we're out of luck.
No. But here's the thing about the 100-hour. Some of these older Cessnas, particularly the ones up until when they started, they restarted production in the late 70s or early 80s, whenever that was. Most of those old Cessnas have recurring ADs on the seat rails.
Yep.
So while I can overfly 100 hour, and I'm not saying that it's smart to do, and I don't do that, but while we can overfly the 100 hour, we can't overfly an AD. And in the case
Right.
of these flight school airplanes, that AD has to be accomplished every time there's an inspection on the airplane, i.e., every 100 hours. So they might bring an airplane to me that's got 99 and a half hours on it. And if it's a brand new, in fact, this actually happened several weeks ago. It was a relatively new Cessna 172, and it was at something like 98 and a half hours or something like that. Well, a typical check ride is an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes for what we were going to do. But there was a chance that we were going to be over the 100 hour by the time we landed. Okay, I know the flight school, I know the airplane, I know the maintenance is stellar, I know the shop that does the work. I'm comfortable with that, but I said let's take a look at the last 100 hour because I want to make sure that there aren't any ADs. And oh, by the way, not just the logbook, but I need to see an AD compliance record.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's not just a list of ADs that you can print off the FAA's website. I'm talking about an actual compliance record that the mechanic has signed off. And so this was one of the newer 172s that didn't have the seat rail inspection. There were no recurring ADs that had to be done on a 100-hour basis. So if we had run over that 100 hours by a little bit, it's not a big deal. Legally, not a
Mm-hmm.
big deal.
Well, there's one other part of the airworthiness that it's worth talking about, I think, because it is entirely within the control of the pilot. That's the walk-around inspection, the pre-flight.
Yes.
Visual inspections are by far the most common type of maintenance, and a visual inspection from a pilot is a maintenance issue. But we're looking for anything that's amiss, aren't we? Anything that popped up that, the last guy that flew it might have thought it was fine, but all of a sudden we recognize there's an issue. And that can be the difference between a successful flight and a truly harrowing experience.
Yeah, and something, it's not just the pre-flight, but how about the post-flight walk around? How about looking at the airplane after you land? I landed in my 182 about 6 weeks ago after a lovely evening flight with my wife to dinner and back. And as I was walking away from the airplane and kind of looking back kind of at the big picture, I noticed a crack in the spinner that was about
Ooh.
halfway around the diameter of the spinner, the circumference of the spinner.
Wow.
And it's a miracle that it didn't come off in flight. I didn't notice it when I pre-flighted the airplane at dinner coming home, but it sure was there when we landed 25 minutes later. Don't know when it happened, but
Well, there's a lot of vibration, there's a lot of forces, and the smallest imperfection can become something big. And I will tell you, this is near and dear to my heart because, like you, I do a post-flight inspection. I wipe the bugs off the leading edges and do a walk around just to see if anything happened. But many years ago, I was instructing, and I was supposed to be flying a PA-28, and I went out and did the walk around, and the plane looked absolutely fine, except underneath the right wing. As it happened, they were extending our runway and there were sawhorses out on the runway. Somebody had come back the night before and landed right on top of one of those sawhorses and tore about a 2-inch strip of metal right out of the underside of that wing. I
wow.
have no idea if it would have held together or not had we gone flying.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of thing you actually, I like high wings because of the shade. We've talked about this, but it's also easy to get under and do an inspection. With the low wing, you have to get on the ground. But even if you're wearing your nicest pair of pants, get on the ground and take a look, because what's happening under that airplane, you could find a massive oil leak that you didn't expect. You could find damage that you didn't expect. You could find something with the gear. And that includes a tire with cords showing. That's no bueno. We don't want to do
No,
that.
we were
But
getting
yeah,
ready to
there's
go
an
to
awful
Oshkosh.
lot you can find. And I mean, it's a huge list, from smoking rivets to cracks
Yeah.
that haven't been stop drilled, or like yours, that crack on the spinner. That's a pretty good indication. Okay, we're fixing this before the next flight. This isn't going to be okay. It's going to get worse.
We were going to Oshkosh a few years ago in a Mooney in this particular flight. And as I was doing the walk around, something caught my eye, to your point, on the belly of the airplane. And one of the 13,000 screws that are on the bottom of a Mooney belly pan had come loose, and it was not in trail of the airflow, but it was catching the airflow. So, a quick trip around the field to the maintenance shop to pick up a machine screw and replace it, and it was great. But I don't know what would have happened if over time, because those are pretty fast airplanes. If over time that belly pan wouldn't have, kind of bent back, and I don't know what would have happened. But we caught it and we fixed it, and off we went.
That's what it's all about. Catching the issue before it becomes a big problem, getting
Yeah.
it fixed, or making a determination. This is not a problem. We can go ahead and fly. Pat, I think we've covered the basics. And now people can walk away from this video more confident, more on top of things, and they can say, I know why I'm doing what I'm doing. And oh, yeah, let's make sure that compass deviation card is actually there.
Yeah. So true. Yeah, this has been fun.
Hey, thanks, man. I do appreciate it. Let's get together and do this again real soon. You want to?
I'm ready whenever you call, Jamie.
Perfect. See you soon.
Okay, bye. That was fun.